Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of discussions with leading scholars in the field. With me today is Adria Lawrence of Yale University and author of the new book, Imperial Rule and the Politics of Nationalism, Anti-Colonial Protest in the French Empire. And she's recently been doing quite a bit of research on Moroccan politics and youth protests. So welcome to George Washington.
Thank you very much.
And so first off, tell us a little bit about the book and kind of what it's about and what you were trying to do.
Sure, I'd be glad to talk a little bit about that. So I think a lot of what we know today about what happens when one country intervenes in the politics of another country comes from our understanding of what happened during the colonial period. So it's now become pretty much a conventional wisdom that nations don't like other nations coming in and messing around and establishing rule or trying to govern people who are vastly different from themselves. So I thought that going back to the colonial period and looking at it would be a good way to sort of think about how it is that nationalist movements get underway. And while I was doing that, I began to think of two puzzles, one of which is that though we now think of nationalism as a very natural and automatic response to having a foreign power come in and impose its rule over you, actually the empires ruled for a long time with very little opposition. So that's one surprising factor. And the second one is that though we would think of nationalism, which swept the whole colonial world, as a very important and very crucial ideology, which I definitely believe it was, it's not the only way that people used to oppose the colonial empire. And I was surprised to find it as I started my research, which started on Morocco. I'm going through the colonial archives and looking at it, and all of the archives are framed as nationalist events trying to overthrow the empire, but a lot of them are about very everyday things, about things that we would think of as better governance. You know, asking the French, hey, you know, can we get more jobs? Can we have more Moroccans represented in the government? And I came to find that a lot of the protest was actually not about nationalism, if you think of that in terms of identity, but actually was de-emphasizing national differences and asking for the French to treat them on a more equal basis. So I came to discover that political equality was equally powerful, maybe more powerful than nationalism.
And so you looked at Morocco?
Yeah, so the book focuses on Morocco, which is where I've done a lot of my research, and I lived there for several years. Morocco's kind of a difficult case for an argument that wants to revisit the strength of nationalism because it was already a state for a long time. It's had a monarchy that's ruled there since the 17th century, and it didn't have a very long colonial period. So I was surprised to find, when I started my research, I thought that it would be a project only on nationalist mobilization, that all the mobilization would be nationalist because I knew that it was already a nation state when the French arrived. And I was surprised to find so much diversity. But the book also compares it to Algeria and to colonial Senegal as well as the other cases, and then broadly across the French Empire.
Now, the finding that there's lots of different grievances that mobilize activism is something that we see across a whole bunch of different cases and time periods. What is it about nationalism that you think is unique, if anything, in terms of its ability to synthesize and, you know?
Okay, that's an interesting question. You know, I actually think what's really unique about nationalism is maybe its ideological emptiness. That, you know, pretty much anybody can use nationalism, and you can tie nationalism to an authoritarian regime. So the nationalists in Morocco started off with maybe an idea of constitutional monarchy, I would argue, you know, in the 30s, that didn't really have a big role for a sultan. And then later, as the colonial period went on, they allied with the sultan, and then he came to be a big symbol of the nation. But that wasn't the way it was at first. But the great thing about nationalism is you can kind of harness it to different ends or different ideologies, because it's really about who the community is, not what that community is going to be like or what kind of government it's going to have.
I think people who look at kind of France and Northern Africa usually pay more attention to Algeria with the violence and, you know, the long struggle. What are the main differences? What do you learn by looking at Morocco alongside Algeria?
I think what you learn, and what surprised me, was that everybody knows that there was this long-standing quest for political equality that possibly that Algeria was a department of France, and they really thought of it as their jewel in the crown, the way the British thought about India, that they could have incorporated it in. There was a debate about whether to extend citizenships to the Algerians, and what's surprising to me about Morocco is that a lot of those same things happened there, even though there was a lot less commitment. Not the same things in terms of asking for citizenship, but the same stress by Moroccan players on democratic rights, and that Moroccans, are open to democracy just as much as Algerians, and were impressed by some of the Republican institutions of France, even while they were not impressed by the colonial policy that France carried out in North Africa.
And what about the kind of class and language differences? Is it similar in Morocco and Algeria in terms of the emergence of a Francophone elite?
I think that the Francophone elite was not as strong there, in part because there was not as lengthy of a history of colonization. That's my impression.
It's interesting. Let's jump over really quickly over to the current period. And I know you've been in Morocco for quite some time and looking at the protest movement. What's your reading of the current status of the Moroccan protest movement?
Well, the current status of the Moroccan protest movement is one that, in which I think that there's active protests, but they're at a very low level. And in terms of the numbers of people or the regularity, I think there's a continual pressure, and interestingly, that some of the demands are still the same for a movement towards a king who reigns but does not rule, who takes less of an active role in politics, and motivated by a diverse number of grievances. So there's a hugely different group of protesters who are interested in jobs, interested in fighting corruption, interested in redistributing wealth, and they have a diverse interests in. But I think they're waiting for the next big opportunity. I think the sense is, the Arab Spring went by and it didn't produce a lot of change there. And now they're saying, well, we're going to keep it up at this low level until there's some other trigger.
But that's interesting. So you actually see some real continuity then in the nature of these popular movements. I
do. And one of the things that I found from interviewing people in the Moroccan February 20th movement, the pro-democracy group there, is that the core activists, the ones who are still going out, I was surprised when I was talking to them to find how many of them had parents who had been politically active in the 70s, maybe in leftist organizations or other kinds of organizations, and who had been repressed by the regime, and now they were carrying that on. And Morocco's not one of the most repressive countries in the region by far. It's so it was surprising to me, and I started wondering, could this really be the case? There's not. I think usually if you talk to people, most of them would not have had this kind of experience. But looking at it in survey data confirmed it as well, that a lot of the core activists had families. So there's a family history of activism going back that gets passed down.
That's really interesting. Is it because they're from particular geographic areas, or is it a particular social class, or is it just one of those things that you seem to inherit the activism gene?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't find any similarities in geography because people moved a lot. Some of them were in the Berber movement in the south and that had their parents experienced some political repression because of that, and some of them were leftist intellectuals, but a lot of them were working class. So I would say that it could be class, though. It could be they're all educated, well educated, so there could be a class element to that. I think from talking to them that what was interesting was that you would expect that if your father had been put in prison or your uncle, that you would be more afraid. But in interviews, they expressed less fear. They expressed a sort of anyone could be repressed, and so we might as well continue the fight. In contrast with other members of the February 20th movement who seemed more fearful, who said that they were more worried about it, and they yet hadn't experienced those same costs.
Now, do you see the current protest movement, the February 20th movement, hearkening back to the themes or the rhetoric of this earlier tradition you write about in the book, or is that more of a forgotten part of Morocco's history?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it probably is more forgotten than. I do think that people look back through history to find moments of time where there's been a possible other direction, and they definitely think that the French shaped Moroccan politics today during the colonial era by lending so much support to the Sultan, who then became the king.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
But you think that at least for now, when you look at the Moroccan protest movement, you still see their demands primarily as reformist and focused on these democratic and economic kind of quality of life sorts of issues?
Yeah, I think that probably the other argument I would make besides talking about sort of the personal histories of them is that for a lot of people, it's very tempting to fight for a genuine constitutional monarchy, which would allow democratization, but without the kind of instability that you see in a revolution. And so that goal, though, is murky. It's hard to get. It's a reformist thing. How can you tell if the king is really moving, or is he just making a pretense of moving in the right direction?
So the reforms thus far, how would you describe them?
I would describe them as very minimal and mostly for show. And they've gotten a lot of praise in the press here. I don't think they've translated into much of a ceding of power on behalf of the monarchy.
All right, well, thank you, Adria Lawrence, Yale University, author of Imperial Rule and the Politics of Nationalism. Welcome to GW.
Thanks very much.